In this video, we're going to go over how to recognize your emotions. The skill of emotional self-control is perhaps the most valuable skill you can ever acquire. And one of the key skills to learn in order to do this is recognizing your emotions. You see, sometimes people have a difficult time identifying their emotions, usually because of one of the following reasons. We were made to think our feelings don't matter. We were made to fear expressing our emotions. We were made to feel guilty if our emotions or desires were an inconvenience on others. Or we were discouraged from feeling or expressing specific emotions. And because of this conditioning, some people stopped expressing their emotions and often repressed them or held them in, while other people went a step further and stopped allowing themselves to have the emotions at all. In either case, this can lead to a lessened ability to recognize how they feel. Even people who did not learn how to repress or turn off their emotions, people who feel them deeply, they can simply not have ever been taught about their emotions, so they cannot clearly identify them. But if you want to regain your power to direct your own emotional state, you will need to be able to notice when you're experiencing an emotional state, identify what it is, know what to expect, and know how to influence a new emotional state. And so what are emotional states? Emotional states are actually two different things in one. The state is the physiological feelings that you experience, and the emotion is the psychological interpretation or label that you put on that state. We experience complex states made up of chemicals and hormones interacting in our bodies and a variety of different bodily reactions. And they become emotions when we interpret those experiences, we label them, and we give them meaning. And so, based on what I talked about in the Thoughts Create Emotions video, we need to add a couple of steps to the process for how thoughts and emotions interact. So, before we said that a situation happens, we interpret it through our thought, and therefore we have an emotion. And so the way that this looks like when we add in the idea of an emotional state having two parts, this is how it looks like. A situation happens, we interpret it with our thought, which of course happens at lightning speed unconsciously. We have a physiological state that then responds, which we then interpret again and give it a label with our mind unconsciously, and then we experience an emotion. So that's what's really going on here. And what this means is that the body actually responds to your thought first. Then your mind interprets it and reacts, labels it, and an emotion is born. You see, we can have physiological feelings that aren't emotions. We can feel hot, cold, nauseous, energetic. But when we interpret those things to have meaning, we believe them to be emotions. Emotion, the word, actually literally means action. Emotion. Each emotional state is actually designed to get us to do something, and often we do. Often our behavior does come from our emotion. Our emotional states affects our behavior, but it doesn't cause it. When we're angry, we are a lot more likely to be aggressive, but our cognitive thought processes actually are what allow us to make the decision on whether or not to act out on the anger that we feel. And so one of the things that's important to talk about when it comes to understanding and recognizing emotions is that the map is not the territory. So let me explain what that means. The labels that we give our emotions are kind of like a box or a map. What's printed on the box may signal what's inside, but it is not what is inside. Just like a map may describe a territory, however, it is not the territory. Maps are simplified, inadequate, and ultimately flawed. It would be like eating a menu. It's not the same thing. In the same way, when we call what we call anger, the word is not the experience. Saying that you love someone hardly does the experience any justice, does it? In fact, all words are simply signposts towards meaning. The word tree is not a tree. And so, what is an emotion if it's not the territory? If it's just a map, just a label, then it's not a thing either. You see, labeling an experience as an emotion makes it seem like it's a noun. This is why so many people believe that emotions are things that they have or things that happen to them. The truth is that emotions are verbs. Actually, the verb of emotion is emoting, by the way. Emotions are a process. Fear is the process of fearing, which is a string of sensations that occur in a pattern. Fear takes many, many steps from observation or contemplation all the way through to processing and interpretation, and then to physiological reaction and feeling, and finally labeling it as fear. So that is an entire process. But if you're obscuring the process underneath a simple word or label like fear, then you end up believing that your emotions aren't under your control. But once you recognize that anger is a process, for example, then you recognize that you have some power over it, because it's not just this thing that's happening to you, it's a process. And once you understand the process that leads to the anger, you can insert your own influence over it. So now I'm going to go over the emotional identification chart. We're focusing here on 6 common emotions so that you can see the contrast between them. And the chart includes descriptions of the emotion, of the physiological state, and of common resulting behaviors, all of which are designed to help you to be able to identify these emotions in yourself and others. It helps give you a general idea of the signs and the symptoms of each emotion to make them easier to identify. Specifically, easier to identify early. Keep in mind that everyone experiences each emotion somewhat differently, and so that you might not relate to all of the experiences listed under each emotion. And whatever each emotion is for you might not be the same for somebody else. And so the first one is happiness. The emotional side of happiness includes an intense, positive feeling of well-being, pleasure, contentment, delight, joy, optimism, or gratitude. It tends to coincide with affirmative, positive thoughts and mental clarity. The physiological state that's going on would include having your head held high in good posture, being wide-eyed, smiling, laughing, general relaxation of your muscles, and open body language. The behavior that you might display or observe in happiness would be a pleasant voice, being friendly, swinging your arms, dancing and moving around. The second emotion is boredom. In contrast to happiness, boredom is actually very low intensity. It's an unpleasant feeling of apathy, restlessness, indifference, emptiness, and frustration. It tends to coincide with defeatist thinking or wishing things were different. Physiologically, you might notice low energy, a slumped posture, a smirk or a frown, low eyes, and shallow breathing. Behaviorally, you might notice yourself or others resting their head, fidgeting, or staring off into space. The next emotion is anxiety. Anxiety is a vague, unpleasant feeling of distress, uneasiness, stress, apprehension, and nervousness. Thoughts tend to be of uncertainty and worry. You tend to have racing thoughts, difficulty concentrating and remembering. Physiologically, the state often looks like restlessness, sweating, clammy hands, hunched shoulders, swallowing, quickened breath, darting eyes, butterflies in the stomach, or nausea. The behaviors that might be displayed include pacing around, biting your lip, fidgeting, irritability, and hypervigilance. The next emotional state is anger. The emotion that you experience in anger is intense. It's very uncomfortable. There are feelings of hostility and hurt. Sometimes you feel out of control. And the thoughts related to anger tend to be blame and resentment. You also might experience difficulty thinking clearly or rationally. The physiological state involved includes muscle tension, headaches, a tight chest, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, heavy breathing, clenched fists, a furrowed brow, showing your teeth, a clenched jaw, sweating, trembling, flushed cheeks, and a large posture. The behavior that might be displayed by somebody with anger can include a loud voice, yelling, cursing, sarcasm, pacing. Sometimes anger leads to aggression, including hitting a wall, throwing an object, or lashing out at a person. The next emotion is sadness or depression. The emotions involved include feelings of intense pain and sorrow, guilt, unworthiness, disappointment, helplessness, gloominess, loss, grief, numbness, meaninglessness, loss of interest. It tends to be associated with defeated thinking and difficulty concentrating and remembering. As a side note, depression is long-term periods of sadness. The physiological state associated with sadness includes slumped posture and hunched shoulders, a long face, slow movements, pouting, body aches, crying, shaking, crossed arms, fatigue, upset stomach, and a monotone voice. Behaviors you may observe include curling up into a ball, laying around, withdrawing from other people, and irritability. And the last emotional state is fear. The emotion itself is an intense feeling of dread, impending doom, or panic due to a perceived danger or threat, whether it's real or imaginary. Thoughts tend to be paranoid or worst-case thinking and hyper-focused on the object of the fear. The physiological state of fear includes increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, alert eyes, high eyebrows. The corners of the cheeks get pulled towards the ear, often flattening out the mouth. You can have clammy hands, sweating, quickened breath, goosebumps, butterflies in the stomach, and a shaky voice. And the behavior that observed with fear often includes freezing, fleeing, or hiding. And so it's interesting to go through these descriptions and to identify which of these different characteristics tend to happen to us when we experience those emotions. And so there's a series of questions that are designed to help you identify and become aware of your own emotions. So next time you catch yourself experiencing an emotion that is distinct, ask yourself the following questions and practice this line of questioning often, especially when you're experiencing an unpleasant emotion. Because the more familiar you get with the questions and the more often you ask, the more aware of your emotional states you get. And it helps you distinguish them. And just by paying attention to them and being aware of them, you'll notice that they actually lessen. And the reason why this is important is the more you're aware of them, the easier you are going to be able to catch them in the act. You're going to be able to catch them early before you're feeling the more extreme cases of these emotions, because anxiety is ultimately a lower level of fear. And so if you can catch yourself when you're feeling anxious, or if you're feeling an even lower level of anxiety, such as uncertainty, then you'll prevent yourself from having to go through the experience of the more intense emotions. So here are the questions. Ask yourself, how do I feel? Identify the feeling itself. Then ask yourself, how do I know that that's how I feel? And asking this question, what it does, it signals your brain to define what it means to you to feel that way. So if your feeling was, well, I feel sad, and you ask yourself, how do I know? It's like, well, I know because my shoulders are slumped down, I'm looking at the floor, I'm talking in a monotone voice, whatever the case may be. Asking, how do I know, helps you identify those characteristics so that you can really see what you do when you're feeling a certain emotion. So then ask yourself, what do I feel specifically? What sensations am I feeling? Where am I feeling them? What locations in my body? Then ask yourself what sounds like somewhat of a strange question, but where in my body did these feelings originate from? Did they start in a certain location? Did they move? Then you can ask yourself, well, when I look at other people, how do I recognize in others when they're experiencing this same emotion? And then do I notice any of those signs or signals within myself? And you can go even further and ask yourself, what do I observe in my body language, my vocal tone, my thoughts, my behaviors? And then just make a note somewhere. If you weren't doing this on paper, it'd be interesting to write it down and keep a journal of what these emotions are to you. Because the more you know yourself and the more you understand what those first steps are, that's why I asked that strange question, those first signals, the first things you feel, the more that you understand what they are, the more you're going to notice them when they happen. And so think about that. If you have an emotion coming, such as sadness, and you know that the very first sign that you're experiencing sadness is that you look to the floor, then what happens is it allows you to catch yourself when you look to the floor before you spiral all the way into a state of sadness. Because when you first become aware of it, that's when you can insert your ability to choose. And that's why recognizing emotions is so important.